Welcome to this kickoff session. And Ian gave a great, inspiring and impressive speech, as always. And it covered not only the dangerous parts of the world, but also covered the positive stories as well. But Japan is not among either of the list, but you mentioned some strength of Japanese foreign policy, and how can we extend that strength? Would be, well, that's a good question. That's probably the spirit of this panel. So to discuss this, we have a great guest. I think she already introduced, but let me introduce again. Mr. Fukazawa is Parliamentary Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs of Japan, and Ambassador Paquet, current ambassador of the EU to Japan. And to his left, Ambassador Kraft, former US ambassador to the United Nations in the Trump administration, and Iran, as you probably know. So let me start with Mr. Fukazawa. Japan plays a very critical role in Asia, in economic and regional security, and also around the world. And can you tell us, or can you elaborate on Japan's leadership across the globe?
Thank you. Allow me to speak in Japanese. As Dr. Bremer pointed out at the outset, the international community becomes increasingly divided and confrontational. It is important to have a recognition that can be shared by all the countries in order to bring the world to a path of cooperation. Based upon this thinking, as the G7 chair this year, Japan has emphasized the importance of principles of a United Nations Charter, such as rule of law and respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity, as well as the principle of human dignity. In particular, Foreign Minister Kamikawa has been focusing upon outreach diplomacy in the less than 3 months since she took office. In September, she visited 10 countries and attended more than 20 international conferences and held more than 80 meetings, including the telephone conferences. She has been at the forefront of diplomacy, actively engaged in face-to-face diplomacy. With regards to Israel-Palestinian situation in the short run, the improvement of humanitarian situation and stabilization as promptly as possible in the short run, and for realization of the two-state solutions in medium to long run, Japan is communicating with relevant countries and continuing diplomatic efforts. The minister visited Israel and Palestine in October at the G7 foreign ministers meeting held immediately afterward in Tokyo. Although the situations are difficult, she has led a discussion to issue a united message as G7, including the humanitarian policies and the subsequent peace process. I myself attended the International Conference on Humanitarian Aid for Gaza Civilians in Paris, hosted by President Macron on November 9th. And once again, I unequivocally condemned the terror attack by Hamas and others and explained Japan's basic stance and humanitarian assistance, and stressed that all acts should be taken in accordance with international law, including international humanitarian law. Even as attention are drawn to the Middle East, responding to the aggression against Ukraine remains a priority for Japan from the perspective of maintaining and strengthening the rule of law. Russia should never be allowed to profit or gain right from the Israeli-Palestinian situation. This year, as G7 presidency and member of the UN Security Council, Japan never allows any attempt to change the status quo by force and has consistently and strongly supported Ukraine, which is suffering from aggression. Japan has pledged a total of $7.6 billion in Ukraine-related assistance to date and plans to hold the Japan-Ukraine Conference for Promotion of Economic Reconstruction in Tokyo next February. Japan will continue to provide assistance that is uniquely Japanese, standing by the Ukrainian people. From a broader perspective, today's threats are diverse, including cyber threats, disinformation, and economic coercion. Japan is no exception. Japan is faced with the most difficult and complex security environment after the World War II. In the National Security Strategy formulated in December, diplomatic power is listed as one of the elements of Japan's comprehensive national strength for security, and will strengthen cooperation with like-minded countries such as Quad and Japan, US, and South Korea based upon Japan-US alliance. We will also work to maintain and strengthen free and open international order in the Indo-Pacific region. Japan has been a pacifist nation, and as a member of Asia and the international community, we will be conducting diplomacy standing by the people. And we respect diversity of the international community, and comprehensive diplomatic position is a foundation of the trust and the source of respect. Based upon this trust, we will be leading the world toward cooperation, and we have the diplomacy based upon rule of law, and the influence of Japan will be further extended.
Well, thank you very much. Very comprehensive answer. Ambassador Kraft, of course, the United States is the most important ally of Japan. And what are the key elements of U.S.-Japan relation that will help drive a U.S. foreign policy?
Thank you for that question. And as Ambassador Emmanuel said, that U.S. and Japan stand shoulder to shoulder. So I feel as if Japan has always been one of our most important allies, but the importance of the U.S.-Japan is increasing with the global situation. Obviously, Japan has been stepping up as a leader on the world stage. Well, we have seen that with the lack of NATO countries stepping up to their 2% of their GDP. Japan, without even being asked, has made that decision to increase their defense budget. They'll be the third largest defense budget in the world, so that's been very promising. I find that not only are they increasing their import of missiles from the United States, but they are also considering permitting their Japanese-made weapons to countries facing invasion, which, as he just mentioned, Ukraine, and their generous support of Ukraine, that's very promising also. And I think that more important than ever, the relationship with the wars that are waging in Europe and in the Middle East, it's really important that we focus on ways that we deter Iran. Because if you can look at Iran and how that relationship is with Russia and against Israel and against Ukraine, that Japan, U.S. maintains that shoulder to shoulder, and that we don't have to look elsewhere in the Pacific. Because if you can understand that China is watching, they're watching the United States, they're watching how we engage with Israel, how we engage with Ukraine, and that gives them a signal as to how we will engage with Taiwan. I just returned back from the Busan Forum in Taiwan, and they are asking, as you said, constantly about U.S. politics and where are we, because we have Israel, because we have Ukraine.
Do you think Japan's influence has increased in Washington in recent years?
I think it's very promising, the Biden administration, if you can see how he has taken the Quad. I mean, I think that's vital to sending us a direct message to China and to Pacific. And, the fact that he had the first ever trilateral summit at Camp David, I mean, that, to me, as Ian said, and as the Prime Minister stated, has set the tone for so many other meetings and has allowed the rest of the world to see the leadership. I mean, I feel it's very promising. If you look at whether it's AUKUS, whether it's the Quad, the summit, the Biden administration has continued the support. And I find that to me, being a former Trump appointee, I find that he has really led from the top there.
All right. Ambassador Paquet, how do you see Japan's global role from European perspective? And I believe that the EU-Japan relations have been very pivotal, especially in the shaping global economic governance and also regulatory structures. Can you tell us, what do you see in this regard?
Well, I think that indeed Japan and Europe have much benefited from the multilateral world order, and I think we are hand in hand fighting to preserve it, to also ensure that there is maybe greater ownership across the world on this construction in trade, but of course the UN particularly, which serves humanity so well. So that I think is the first thing to say. Europe and Japan are really working hand in hand for that. Beyond the work we're doing globally, I think on the summit here, Ian, I think it's important to say that yes, there are challenges in terms of international leadership, but I think the collective leadership of the G7 under Japanese presidency has been rather spectacular in 2023. And of course, I was a bit too close to it, so maybe my judgment is a bit blurred by that. But I find that the Hiroshima summit really captures that need, which you mentioned, Ram said it as well, and the Prime Minister differently, but as well, to revisit the policies and the instruments of trade, economic, but also security diplomacy, and adjust it indeed to these very difficult circumstances. And Hiroshima captures that particularly spectacularly. And I think it will resist the test of time from that point of view also. Now, in terms of the relationship between the European Union and Japan, we have concluded now, nearly 5 years ago, the most integrated free trade agreement available anywhere, the European Partnership Agreement. And despite the pandemic, the value of trade and services between Japan and Europe have increased by more than 20% over that period. And that, I think, testifies to the very intense activity of operators across Japan and Europe. We compete a lot, but there's also more and more cooperation. And that economic partnership agreement is, of course, the foundation of the relationship today and allows, therefore, Japan and Europe to work also in our digital transformation. I mean, the DX is supported by the digital partnership between Japan and Europe. Maybe here just to say that the Hokkaido Valley of Lapidus, this is based on Europe. Without ASML and without IMEC, the research organization, Lapidus cannot develop. Of course, the investment, the intelligence is Japanese. There will be, of course, a lot of work with the US as well. But at the outset, the research and the technological capacity is with Europe. So on digital, there's a lot happening, as is the case also for our green partnership, where we are working on carbon pricing. We are working on a methane pledge. Japan, alongside Europe and many others, has now this pledge, which the Prime Minister mentioned, on tripling renewable energy and energy efficiency alongside. All that are really elements of the work between Europe and Japan. And I would finish by underlining that what I think is also at play is that Japan and Europe are reaching out to the world. I don't speak myself of the global south. At some point, it was the so-called global south. I think it's the so-called global south, frankly. And, but what it is that we have partners. We have partners in Asia, we have partners in Africa, we have partners in Latin America. And we need to work differently and extend a better offer. And in many cases, I would argue, and this is a discussion with Japan, we should team up to extend a better offer. So this, if you want, in a nutshell, is a little bit the depths of the common work between Japan and the European Union. And you said rightly, Ian, earlier on, that there will be stability in Europe. And the stability in Japan and the stability in Europe can be one pole of resilience in these difficult times.
We're talking about the global south. Iran, Prime Minister Kishida made a priority the relation with the global south, and he said that in his speech. And of course, the relation with the global south has been more critical than before to any country's foreign policy. And you mentioned India in your speech as well. Do you see Japan is doing good enough vis-a-vis the global south so far?
Well, I think what it's doing well. It's not doing a lot. So it's trusted. Its relationships are either quite positive or absent across most of the global south countries. And this is a place where, I mean, I understand the so-called, because I think it was in the Financial Times recently that they said, look, we've moved from developing countries, emerging markets, to global south. And the difference is that when we talk about developing countries and emerging markets, we're using an economic lens. We're not worried about geopolitics. We're basically saying we're heading towards convergence. The most important thing is we're getting these countries development. But in an environment where globalization is becoming more fragmented, where nationalism and populism is becoming more of a driver, where we're talking about nearshoring, and we're not talking about the economic efficiencies, where geopolitics are driving instability, it's not surprising that the formulations we start using to talk about these countries and that they want to use to talk about themselves are geopolitically driven. That is a fundamental problem for the global order. I agree with you, Ambassador, that the G7 collectively has been more important, in part because the G20 is failing. I mean, there's no more G7+1 because Russia's a war criminal. The G20, when they get, India did the best job they possibly could, but the fact is there's not a lot of alignment among those countries. So instead you get smaller groups that are sub-global but can do something. And my view would be Japan is never going to be the leader on Western outreach to the global South. But on specific issues where the Japanese have influence and can create smaller like-minded groups, absolutely. So I didn't talk much about AI. We've got a whole lunch devoted to it. I'm very interested in the topic. Japan is nowhere in global leadership on AI right now, and they're not going to be. They don't invest enough. They don't have the players. They just don't have it. Irrespective of the Hiroshima announcement. But there are other issues, like when I think about where Japan can be on development of transition energy, or if I were to talk about robotics, for example, and robotics are pretty important as we think about what AI is going to do globally. Those are areas where the Japanese can play an absolute leadership role. So the point, in the same way that you can't have global, you can have the G7, you can't have Japan leadership on the global South, but you can pick your spots. And I think doing that effectively, and hopefully Kishida's announcement here at the summit will reflect some of those things, those will be effective.
Yeah, that's interesting to see. Now, the global crisis have mounted over the last 2 years. Russia, Ukraine, and Israel, Hamas, and China, Taiwan, and many others. And also the accelerated risk of AI and emerging technology. I don't know, you call it, is the positive story or negative story. AI is changing the world. Now, so my question is how Japan's global relations have been impacted or strained by these developments or outside, what we call outside pressure or global situations, has anything to do with the future course of Japan's foreign policy. Now, Mr. Fukazawa, in terms of regional relations, how are cross-strait pressures and the outside role of China impact Japan's policy?
Relationship with China, relatively speaking, on the rightist people in Japan are critical to the position of Japan. I am aware of that. But basically, the government of Japan will be pursuing various possibilities, and at the same time, in the East China Sea and South China Sea, in attempts to unilaterally change the status quo by force and the coercion, and also military activities in the surrounding areas, including China-Russia cooperation, various challenges exist vis-à-vis China. At the Japan-China summit and Japan-China foreign ministers meeting held last month, we exchanged frank views on a wide range of issues from a broad perspective, while clearly conveying Japan's position on various bilateral concerns. The external posture of China and military situation is a serious concern for Japan and the international community, and we have to secure stability and rule of law, and we should be strengthening international law order. And the largest strategic challenge for us, unprecedented in scale. At the same time, Japan and China has big responsibility to play for the peace and stability and prosperity of the world. We have to assert what needs to be asserted. We urge China to act responsibly, and we will have dialogue dialogue and cooperate where there is common interest, and we maintain the efforts for stable and constructive relationship by the efforts of both sides. The tension between the across the strait and the position and China, how does it impact Japanese policy? Was your question. Issues surrounding Taiwan can be resolved by dialogue in a peaceful manner. That is our expectation, consistent position of Japan. The peace and stability of the Taiwan Strait, we will directly communicate to China and work closely with the allies and like-minded countries and send the message clearly as a common position of Japan and the international community.
Statement calling for dialogue among the sides. Ambassador Paquet, the war in Ukraine is taking place on the EU's, let's say, periphery, in your regions. And do you think this sustained conflict in your region impact Japan-EU relations in any way?
Oh, it has. It has massively impacted the relations. I think it has the way Japan immediately supported Ukraine, worked with Europe and the United States to support Ukraine, was of course a key player also in the UN system. I think this has injected massive momentum in the relationship. I described the institutional setup where EU member states and EU institutions work with Japan, but that political choice, which was made really overnight here in Japan, has injected that momentum. So yes, it has. And the Europeans, of course, are today continuing to support Ukraine for as long as it will be needed. There is a massive macro-financial assistance, but also in terms of military assistance, Europe is providing as much assistance as the US, in fact, on par. In fact, just a tiny bit more right now, but on par. And in terms of defensive equipment, but also economic support, energy support, Japan is very much present too. So this, I think, has been indeed particularly important. What has also changed matters is the security architecture in Europe is indeed now changing massively. And I think you mentioned that earlier on at some point. And I think from that, what is also very visible is that European member states and the European Union, we are now a defense or security player, a full security player. And this is very recognized here in Japan as well. And this is leading us to now discuss beyond the partnerships which I noted earlier on. In 2024, we will be working on a security partnership, which will cover certainly a number of areas which are so critical also here in the region: cybersecurity, manipulation of information, and many other developments. And that maybe leads me to the last point to say that Kishida-san's a very strong point when he attended the NATO summit last year to say that this is one security theater from Ukraine to the Taiwan Strait to the Indo-Pacific is something which I think resonates very much and is very much part of the strategic dialogue between the Europeans and Japan.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Ambassador Kraft, the U.S. domestic political situation is fractious. I don't know if we include this as a risk for the world, but I think it is. How does it mean for Japan and the world? I mean, the fractious political environment in the States.
Well, you know, I think that Japan is a thriving democracy, so we all know that democracy is messy. But just like the Japanese people, the American people have a moral compass. And we are going to do the right thing, and we are going to make certain that we continue regardless of a fractious, and I'm going to be the first to say, yes, it is very fractious in our political environment. Mm-hmm. However, as Ian has said, sometimes you have to look at the good news that's underneath. So let's look at the recent Reagan Institute poll, if I may, that this is a bipartisan support. 71% for Israel, 67% supported helping Ukraine, 65% helping Taiwan. And this was important because, A, 70% of Republicans were part of this particular poll done by the Reagan Institute. And I think that's important because the Republicans or Americans were making these statements without someone making the case for them. So therefore, the people, once they're educated and they understand the importance of the U.S. maintaining the world power, because most people didn't even know what AUKUS was, most American people. But once they're educated, then they change their opinion because they understand the place that America has in the world.
Yeah, but what the young people in the States, well, they are educated about the situation in Palestine, right, in Gaza. So that will change the dialogue in the States in terms of relation and policy about Israel and Palestine.
Yes, I see that with the media. I mean, we're going obviously into an election 2024, and the media is so obsessed with especially the Republican candidates, and building up this division that we're not focused on Israel. We're not, from a pro-Israel individual, we're not focused on the importance of maintaining Israel, the importance of Israel not only to the U.S., but to the rest of the world. And the fact that President Xi is watching how the U.S. conducts themselves and how we handle the Middle East, how we handle Ukraine, and that's the way that they're going to be seeing that we're going to be projecting for our support for Taiwan.
But again, the United States looks isolated diplomatically in the conflict of Gaza. Do you think that it affects the U.S. leadership in the world because of their stance about the situation in Gaza?
You know, I think what started to affect the U.S. leadership or the people looking into us was Afghanistan. We've had, several mishaps, I feel, of pulling out from Afghanistan and leaving NATO countries wondering what was going to happen when they were left there. But if you educate the American people, they're the ones that are going to be voting. If you educate them the importance of Israel, if you also educate the importance that this is Hamas. Hamas is a funded terror group with Iran, just as Hezbollah, just as the Islamic jihadists. They have to understand that Iran and Russia, all the relationships matter. Because if we don't deter Iran as the United States, then the rest of the world's watching. And this is only going to reflect how people are going to perceive the U.S. as far as in the strength. And he's right about the G7. It's collective. It used to be where it was the United States. And now it is more it has to be collective because of what's happening in the U.S. at the time. I mean, coming from the Trump administration, and I'm sure you all watch the news every day, that President Trump is already presumed going to be the candidate. But I have to say I disagree. I think we have a great field of candidates. We have Ambassador Nikki Haley, who was my predecessor. She's been really shown her foreign policy knowledge and how strong she is standing with Israel, standing with Ukraine. I mean, everybody has seen that Congress is very concerned that we can't have our Ukraine, our funding. Well, under particular leadership with Ambassador Haley, then we would have this funding. And I think it's really important that people look above that rhetoric and look at the candidates and their individual views, because it matters.
Great. We'll probably talk about the elections in the next segment of this discussion. But Ian, you've been telling us about AI. It is probably the good story of the current times, but also we see it as a risk for the world. And I wonder what you can tell us the key risks facing Japan and the world vis-a-vis AI and other emerging technologies.
Look, it is mostly a good story. It is mostly a force for progress, for efficiency, for education, for intelligence, for reducing waste. I think it can drive a new globalization. Trillions of dollars will be invested in AI and related technologies in the coming years. It is moving 3 times faster than Moore's Law, so a doubling every 6 months as opposed to 18 months. ChatGPT-4 is a child's toy compared to GPT-5, which is coming out in the next year. I mean, I am an enthusiast. I'm a believer. But because the people that are all in power, they're only focusing on that side of it. So you don't need me focusing on that side of it. Like, that's going to take care of itself. Those are the most competitive, smartest people in the world with a lot of money. They won't be stopped. Look at Sam Altman. He won't be stopped. A nonprofit board will not stop him, right? But the negatives are real. Some of the negatives are about job displacement. Some of the negatives are about the proliferation of use for disruptive means. So if you can use it to code, you can also use it to hack. You can use it to have vaccines. You can also use it to create viruses. And you don't need many people to do that, right? And it becomes much more dangerous. But I'm more worried about the broader, harder to measure dangers of AI, and there are two of them, and the second one gets to what Kelly was just saying. The first one is, I don't know if AI is going to be fundamentally a strength for democracies or for authoritarian regimes. I don't know if AI will be a strength for competitive free markets or for oligopolistic and monopolist platforms or planned economies. And I know what I prefer. I want it to support democracies, but in the next 5 years, I'm not sure that's true. And a big determination of the winners and losers in our geopolitical order will be the answer of whether the technology facilitates or undermines centralized or competitive open systems. We're going to find out. And the EU is trying to regulate that. The Americans are trying to regulate it in different ways. Ultimately, the technology is going to win. That's my view. I think it's too much money, it's too fast. I don't think it will be governed effectively or in a unified way. But the final point, Kelly said twice, we got to educate the people. If we could just educate the kids, that would resolve it. How you educate the people is really matter. Before you educate people, we've got our genes. We all have genes, and that determines some level of who we are as people and how we behave, our lizard brains, all this kind of stuff, right? But after that, when we emerge into society, it used to be that the education that we got that determined how we would think politically came from our families and our social institutions, our schools, our athletic leagues, our community institutions, the church. Now, why is the United States breaking down right now politically? Why? And it's because that has fallen apart and has been replaced with a new type of education that comes from algorithms. And that young people are being educated on their smartphones to connect with people that think just like them and to dislike people that don't like them. It's tribal, it's divisive, it's emotive, it's not responsible, and it's certainly not global. It is the opposite of the leadership we need. So you want to educate people? Great. But you can't educate people through business models that make human beings into products. That's not education. And we, right now, need to regulate these people. You've got a group of 10 men in the West who individually, not collectively, individually are educating billions of people to hate each other. It's the opposite of democracy. We will destroy our society if this continues unchecked.
Well, that's scary. But how can we have a
That's scary, but. You just but. You just pivoted away. That's scary, but. Okay.
How can we have a non-biased algorithm to educate the people?
No. You can't. So what that means is, number one, you've got to invest more in the institutions so people aren't just I want smartphones out of schools. Out of schools. I mean, we're going to ban TikTok because we don't want the Chinese to abuse our kids. We only want Americans to abuse our kids. I don't care. I want them out of schools. I want verified platforms where you're interacting with other human beings. And AI, sorry, child safe. Under 18, no. You're not going to be exposed to it unless it's being supervised by a teacher in a class, for an educational purpose. And I also want these algorithms tested, not just tested if you can break them to build a virus, tested on populations, on small populations, to see what effect they have on the brain and on development before you actually run them in society. You know, when we had a pandemic, we created vaccines. We needed those vaccines. We still tested them for months before we approved them. You do a GMO, you test it before you approve it. You don't just say, hey, it's a new GMO, everybody eat it. You got to test it. We are testing these algorithms real time on our children globally. Not acceptable. Not acceptable. That has to be regulated. The US executive order on AI does not address this issue. It's a good piece of regulation. You know why? Because the companies don't agree.
Oh, too bad.
It's a problem.
Yes.
EU legislation does address it.
The EU, yes, although the EU AI Act has some problems right now.
As well, the Digital Single Market Act, the digital, they do address the issue of transparency of algorithms. The testing phase you described, not enough yet, but the transparency is there.
The only people that are close to addressing this issue, inadequately, but the only people that are close, the only institutions right now in the world, the EU, the UN. That's it. And the EU is slow and kind of not, and has the private sector pushing and Macron pushing against it. And the UN has no money and no power.
No executive power,
Yeah, but otherwise we're in great shape.
All right, thank you. Let me move on to another topic, what happens in 2024 next year. We will already be talking about the election, US elections. Whole world is watching what happens. And an easy question to Ambassador Kraft. Who's going to win the elections?
So we had that discussion in the back room, right? That was supposed to be off the record. I am a former Trump appointee, so I can tell you that representing his policies in Canada, which is where I was the ambassador first, where we negotiated the largest trade deal in American history, USMCA. His policies were strong. His policies were firm. Yes, he was America first in negotiating this particular trade agreement. And then going to the United Nations, I mean, I sat across his desk at the Oval Office and I defended the UN. I had to defend the UN to the end, to almost the whole cabinet. I believe in the United Nations. I believe in the UN because it is the only stage for the Global South. It is their only hope of being heard, especially in today. If you look at the rhetoric that we're seeing around the election, I mean, my husband and I are engaged with several of the candidates, being personal friends. You know, I look at President Trump's policies serving underneath him at the UN and then obviously in Canada. They kept our country safe. They kept the world. We did maintain that leadership status. We did maintain our defense budget. However, times have changed. He has legal matters. Times have changed. We have other candidates that have stepped up. If you listen carefully, you've got, obviously Ambassador Haley understands her foreign policy from her time at the United Nations. She understands the importance of the U.S. maintaining the leadership on the global stage. And then if you go from, Ian and I have had this discussion, if you look at Vivek Ramaswamy and you see where he stands, what a difference. What a difference. Well, that's where it's fractured. So the press is really doing a marvelous job. And our children, our young adults, are only reading the snippets that the algorithms are saying that so they too are looking at Ukraine and saying, why is Congress, why are we going to fund Ukraine? Why are we supporting Israel? You look at the universities and you see what's happening at the universities against Israel. We have to have a candidate, whether it is former President Donald Trump, whomever it is, that takes being a global leader seriously. This is an exclusive club, and the G7 needs to be treated that way. We don't need to dissolve NATO. We don't need to make light of any of the organizations, because the world is watching U.S. And I tell young adults constantly that we don't have a body double. The U.S. has no body. This is not a Broadway play. Sure, we have Iran, we've got Venezuela, we have Russia, we have all the rogue nations waiting to take our place, China, but we don't have that. We need to be firm, we need to be strong, and these candidates, we have a debate coming up on the 6th, Republican, that's something to be watched, to see how the candidates, now that we're 50, let's see, how many days in from is October 7th into this, with Israel, to see where they stand, because we were just barely in it with this last debate. And just to see where the candidates are. I think that as we start narrowing down our field, you're going to have more substantive issues. People are going to have to make issues, declarations of issues, instead of just fighting amongst one another.
Even before the election day, it happens that the campaign rhetoric sometimes affect foreign policies. And what do you think we have to be careful about campaign rhetoric before the elections?
I mean, I hold the media accountable. And I hold those of us who understand what the media is portraying, we need to be held accountable. Because especially our young voters, their only news is a snippet. I mean, I just ran for governor of the state of Kentucky, and we, the families, and you were saying that the families, the education, it all starts at home. And young adults are no longer gathering in their homes. You don't have that time together. You're not having that discussion about American politics. So we're losing that. We need to be held accountable. We need to share the message of what is true, what is right, and that it is imperative that this election, that we elect a leader who is going to understand that our allies, we have to stand with our allies.
All right, thank you. Ambassador Paquet, in 2024, next year, how do you see the future of EU-Japan strategic dialogue? You already mentioned both the relations, but what happens and what do you see the importance of that next year?
Yeah, I think I can probably cover three elements very quickly, but I will start with the first one, which is not necessarily the one which is the easiest, but I think it's probably the most important one, which is to work together on climate policies. I think we have not discussed them much this morning, but I think when you look at the science, and that's what the UN does so well at the IPCC report, in fact 2050 is not so important. Huh? We all focused on 2050. 2050 doesn't really matter. What matters is 2030, to reduce effectively emissions by 40–45%, and we are not on track. And I think from that point of view, what is being discussed now in Dubai and the work we do with Japan under the Green Alliance is going to be absolutely critical in 2024 to get renewable energies out there at scale. And this is also our security of supply in the end, for Europe, for Japan, for many others as well. So the Green Alliance between Europe and Japan is going to be a major item in 2024. The second key element, and it's of course very, very strictly connected, it was mentioned this morning by the Prime Minister, is economic security. I think changing one dependency with another is not particularly smart. So we need to work indeed on economic security, we need to protect ourselves, and we need to do this consistently across like-minded partners. This is very much part of the very productive debate between Japan and the EU and with the US as well. We need to promote our industries. That's happening in Europe, that's happening in Japan, in the US, in like-minded countries, and we need to partner. So economic security and building supply chains, I think, is going to be a major continuous area of cooperation next year. And if I look a little bit at this multipolar world, leaderless to an extent, multipolar world, you have this triangle of Japan leading Asia in cooperating with the US. You have the other segment where the European Union with Europeans is working also very closely with the US and Canada. And then you have the lower segment, which is Asia, led by Japan and the Europeans. A lot is happening, as I'm trying to bring across this morning, but much more can be done. And I think that is really what 24 in economic security is about. And lastly, and I'm coming back to what the Prime Minister said on futures industry, I think this is a great initiative. This is really what we should do, extend a better offer to our partners and do it in where it adds value, and it's not the case everywhere, but there will be plenty of places where the edge of Japan or the edge of Europe and maybe the edge of the US are different, and teaming up can make a real difference. So I very much also expect a lot of work being done on critical raw materials, on industry, on renewable industry, on hydrogen, and other areas where Japan and Europe will work together in 24.
Great, thank you very much. Mr. Fukazawa, what are the key priorities of Japanese diplomacy next year?
As have been discussion about the elections impacting politics next year, U.S. presidential election and other elections are scheduled. And Israel, Palestine, Ukraine, Russia, we are at a critical stage. And one priority, it's very difficult to focus upon any particular priority, but basically rule of law and free and open international order is to be strengthened and maintained. And the dignity of human dignity, we should be able to share such values with the rest of the world, and we have to assert our position. Last week, I attended in the Europe Securities Conference as well. The Prime Minister Kishida's statement at the NATO summit was touched upon. Israel, Palestine, Russia, Palestine, and the Indo-Pacific security are integral part. And in the OSCE meeting, Europe, Pacific, and Indo-Pacific are indispensable, inseparable. We are able to share the same recognition. So Japan should be spreading the value which can be shared by the international community. We should take every possible opportunity to express our views. That is a priority for diplomacy in Japan.
Thank you. Ian, as you said that also the Kishida-san's approval rating, or the cabinet ratings, approval ratings is quite low these days, the lowest in the last probably 10 years or so since the LDP returned to power. And the presidential election of the LDP is scheduled in September next year. So we have to think about the Japanese domestic political situation when we think about the Japan's diplomatic role. We have to keep in mind that. And with that, do you have anything to say, the final words about Japan's challenge for the year ahead?
Look, it was a little awkward for me to talk about the Prime Minister's approval ratings, 15 minutes after he was speaking to all of us. But those of you that know me know I'm still going to say what I'm going to say. And I think Japan is interesting because essentially what we have said is Europe, individual European countries are weak, and they're getting weaker. But the EU brings them together. The United States politically is getting more divided and weak, but the G7 is actually helping align the world's advanced economies. So both of these similar dynamics are playing out on both levels. And the question is, what are we doing here in Asia? On the one hand, Japan doesn't have the domestic problems that the European countries do, or that the United States does. There's less inequality, there's more homogeneity, the social contract is more robust, the community institutions continue to exist. I mean, there just hasn't been as much change or impact. So Japan is nowhere close to the existential democratic crisis that you have in other places. But Japan is also right next to China, right next to North Korea, right next to Russia. This is an environment where everyone is spending on new technologies, new defensive capabilities that can become offensive capabilities. Japan is in a much, much more challenging geopolitical environment. And my biggest worry for Japan, look, I agree with Rahm Emanuel. I mean, Japan is still going to be a critical ally of the United States if Trump wins. That doesn't suddenly change just because of that one guy. But Japan might start feeling much more on its own. Much more like if the shit hits the fan, are the Americans really there for them? Can we count on America? You know, you go back to TPP or Afghanistan or the JCPOA, the Iranian deal, or, you know, the Paris Climate Accord or the World Health Organization. I mean, heck, even one of the funny things. So Biden, right, the beginning of the war in Gaza, he offers $6 billion for Iran. He's going to unfreeze it if they release the prisoners. So they release 5 American prisoners. Then the Gaza war starts, and he's like, actually, we're going to keep it frozen. I mean, so even the Iranians, I mean, fool them once, fine. Fool them twice. It's a little embarrassing. The Japanese have to start thinking about that. This is Ninami-san's plan B. Japan needs a plan B. Not because America doesn't do a lot with Japan, not because America is going to suddenly be buddy-buddy with China, but more that the biggest country in the world and the most critical ally is just much more in question. That's a really, really big question for 2024. It's a geopolitical question. It's one that I know the Prime Minister is personally very exercised with.
Great. Thank you very much. So we have to wrap up this session. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you.